Picture this, the year is 476 AD and you've just inherited the Roman Empire. Congratulations, except there's no money, no army, no government. The cities are empty, the roads are crumbling, and everyone who knew how anything worked is dead. Oh, and barbarian warlords are carving up your territory as we speak. What do you do? This is the impossible situation medieval rulers faced, and their desperate solutions changed politics forever. This wasn't a hypothetical question. This was the actual nightmare facing the Germanic kings who took over Western Rome. They were military leaders who commanded a few hundred warriors. Now they suddenly ruled millions of people scattered across former Roman provinces. They had no bureaucrats, no tax system, no infrastructure. The Roman administrative machine, the thing that actually made the empire function, had simply evaporated. For the next 1,000 years, European rulers would struggle with this fundamental problem. How do you govern people who don't want to be governed? How do you maintain power when you don't have the tools of power? Their answers, brilliant, brutal, and often accidental, would create representative government, rule of law, and the modern state. This is how medieval Europe invented politics. The first barbarian kings tried to rule through sheer intimidation. It didn't work. You can conquer with violence, but you can't govern with it. People simply scatter into the forests, and suddenly you're king of nothing. So the new rulers made a deal with the only other organized institution left standing, the Catholic Church. Here's how it worked. Kings would protect church property and spread Christianity. In exchange, priests would tell everyone that kings were chosen by God himself. Disobey the king, you're disobeying God. It was propaganda, but brilliant propaganda. The Merovingian dynasty of Francia pioneered this strategy. They called themselves Most Christian Kings and plastered their divine right all over their coins and charters. For a while, it worked beautifully. But there was a fatal flaw in this arrangement. If the church made kings legitimate, the church could also unmake them. And within 3 generations, the Merovingian kings discovered they'd given away their actual power. They still had fancy titles and divine right, but real authority had shifted to their chief administrators, the mayors of the palace. These mayors commanded armies, collected revenues, and made all real decisions. One mayor, Charles Martel, became so powerful he didn't even bother consulting his king. In 732, when Islamic armies invaded from Spain, Charles gathered the Frankish forces, rode south, and crushed them at the Battle of Tours. It was one of history's decisive battles, and Charles did it all without royal permission. The king's divine right meant absolutely nothing. Military power was everything. Charles' son Pepin inherited this awkward situation. He had all the power but none of the legitimacy. So in 751, he asked Pope Zachary a revolutionary question. Who should really be king, the man with the title or the man with the power? It was a trap, and Pope Zachary walked right into it intentionally. The Pope declared that Pepin, the man with actual power, should be king. Pepin deposed the Merovingian king, and a papal representative anointed him as the new monarch. For the first time in history, the Catholic Church had openly made and unmade kings. A precedent was set, and in medieval politics, precedents were weapons. Pepin's son was Charlemagne, and he understood the power game better than anyone. He gave the Pope what the Pope wanted: military protection, destroyed the Pope's enemies in Italy, and conquered pagans across Europe in Christianity's name. In return, on Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. More than 300 years after Rome's fall, Western Europe had an emperor again. But Charlemagne's empire revealed a brutal truth about medieval power. It couldn't scale. You couldn't delegate real authority because the moment you did, your subordinates would use it against you. Charlemagne spent 46 years constantly traveling, personally intimidating every count, duke, and bishop into obedience. He crushed 18 major Saxon rebellions. He executed 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day to make a point. This wasn't governing, this was running a protection racket across half a continent. The instant Charlemagne died in 814, everything started falling apart. His son Louis tried to hold it together but failed. Louis' three sons fought each other in a brutal civil war. In 843, they divided the empire into three kingdoms in the Treaty of Verdun. But even that wasn't enough. Those kingdoms kept fracturing, splintering, fragmenting. Power was cascading downward like a waterfall and nobody could stop it. By 900, Europe had discovered that centralized power, Roman-style government, was simply impossible in the medieval world. There wasn't enough money, enough roads, enough communication, enough literacy, enough anything to make it work. So Europe stumbled into a completely different system, one that would define the next 5 centuries. When Vikings started raiding from the north, Magyars from the east, and Muslim pirates from the south, kings couldn't respond fast enough. Their kingdoms were too large, communications too slow. Local strongmen took matters into their own hands. They built castles, first wooden, later stone, and defended their own territories. They swore oaths to bigger lords who swore to kings, creating chains of personal loyalty stretching across Europe. This was feudalism. And here's the genius. It made weakness a feature, not a bug. A king didn't need to control everything directly anymore. He just needed his top vassals to honor their oaths. And those vassals stayed loyal because they needed their own vassals to honor oaths to them. It was a pyramid of mutual dependence. But there was a massive problem. It gave every noble with a castle the ability to tell the king no. And in 1075, someone decided to weaponize that fact. Pope Gregory VII issued a revolutionary decree. From now on, only the Pope could appoint bishops. Kings were banned from church affairs entirely. Emperor Henry IV of Germany was furious. Bishops weren't just priests, they were nobles who controlled vast territories. Henry declared Gregory deposed. Gregory's response was nuclear. He excommunicated Henry and released all his vassals from their oaths of loyalty. Henry's empire immediately started disintegrating. Rebellious nobles saw their chance. Henry's support collapsed in weeks. Faced with total destruction, Henry did the unthinkable. He crossed the Alps in winter, walked to the fortress of Canossa where Gregory was staying, and stood outside in the snow for 3 days begging for forgiveness. Gregory had won, or so it seemed. Because when Gregory pushed even harder, Henry snapped. He invaded Italy, installed his own pope, and forced Gregory into exile. Gregory died alone and defeated, except he hadn't really lost. Gregory's idea that the church should be independent from kings survived him. Within decades, the papacy had transformed itself into the most sophisticated government in Europe. The church built courts, tax systems, legal codes, and a continent-wide bureaucracy answering only to Rome. Papal legates traveled everywhere enforcing church law. Cardinals elected popes in organized conclaves. Canon lawyers codified centuries of precedent. European kings watched this happen with a mixture of fear and envy. The church had solved the problem of power. It had created a government that actually worked. And kings decided to copy it. In England, Norman conquerors created the Domesday Book, a complete survey of every piece of property in the kingdom. They sent traveling justices to enforce royal law in every corner. They built a common law system that bypassed feudal courts entirely. When nobles rebelled against King John's overreach, they forced him to sign Magna Carta in 1215. It was supposed to protect noble privileges. But it accidentally established something revolutionary. Even kings must follow the law. In France, Philip Augustus simply bought and conquered his way to dominance, expanding royal territory until he controlled more land than any of his vassals. His grandson Louis IX created a professional bureaucracy of lawyers and accountants. In Spain, Christian kingdoms were growing stronger through their reconquest of Muslim territories. Ferdinand and Isabella would eventually unite Aragon and Castile through marriage, creating a unified Spanish state. By 1200, European kings were learning that organization beats raw force. Bureaucracy beats feudalism, but they still had one problem: money. Kings needed taxes for their growing administrations. But feudal law was clear: you couldn't just take money from your subjects, you needed their consent. So kings started summoning assemblies. In England, Parliament; in France, the Estates General; in Spain, the Cortes. The deal was simple: approve our taxes and we'll listen to your complaints. It was supposed to be a tool of royal power, a rubber stamp that gave a veneer of legitimacy to royal demands. Instead, it gave nobles, clergy, and even commoners a platform to negotiate with the king. They started attaching conditions to tax grants. They demanded investigations of royal officials. They insisted on reviewing how money was spent. Representative government was born from a budget crisis. Then in 1347, something happened that changed everything. The Black Death arrived. Within 3 years, 1/3 of Europe was dead. Entire villages disappeared. Cities lost half their populations. It was an apocalypse. But for survivors, the economics suddenly flipped. Labor became scarce, land became abundant, peasants could negotiate, workers demanded higher wages. When lords refused, revolts erupted in France, in England, in Flanders, everywhere. The rebellions were brutally crushed. But the economic reality couldn't be suppressed. Serfdom started dying in Western Europe. Workers gained mobility. Money replaced feudal obligations. The old social order was collapsing. And then gunpowder finished what plague started. Cannons could demolish any castle. A peasant with an arquebus could kill an armored knight from 100 yards away. The entire military basis of feudalism, the mounted warrior in his fortified stronghold, became obsolete practically overnight. Only kings could afford the new artillery armies. They required professional soldiers, massive logistics, and constant funding. It was impossibly expensive. But it gave kings something they'd never had: a monopoly on military force. Nobles who'd once been independent warlords became courtiers, administrators, and officers in royal armies. The warrior aristocracy transformed into a service nobility. By 1500, Europe had created something unprecedented: the sovereign territorial state. France, England, and Spain were recognizable nations. Kings ruled defined territories with borders. They commanded standing armies. They collected regular taxes through professional bureaucracies. They made law through increasingly representative institutions.